I came here during World War II. I found me a husband and I stayed. And my husband was J.B. Pace. I know some of you who have been here for a while can remember him with his front end loader. He ran a front end loader for 40 years. And his daddy was named Ransom Pace, and if one of the hotels was owned by another Ransom Pace who was a cousin, and they called my father-in-law Bud to differ each one of them. And Bud Pace, the father-in-law, was married 3 times and had 29 children. And my husband was number 25. So thank you for having me.
The railroad brought growth and expansion to the quiet Paces Gap, now known as Saluda, which means in Indian tongue Green River or Corn River. Saluda's growth was but an accident. At approximately 11 a.m., the first train came up the grade on July the 4th, 1878. The railroad stopped once it topped the Saluda Grade, and to continue their journeys, travelers had to take horse and buggies, stages, wagons, and horseback to complete their trip. It was no surprise when Saluda blossomed into a growing, vibrant community. The resulting mercantile community that grew from this fortunate occurrence provides the current residents with its main street, shops, restaurants, and community establishments. The first train to Hendersonville ran on July the 7th, 1879, 1 year after the first train came to Saluda. In February 1881, the town of Saluda was chartered. In 2011, the town celebrated its 130th anniversary. By the 1890s, several boarding houses, inns, and hotels had been erected. By the early 1900s, there were some 40 inns, hotels, and boarding houses to bed and feed the railroad workers and visitors, mainly from the lower country of South Carolina. This is Mountain House, the first hotel in Saluda, built about 1877 by Colonel Andrew Tanner, who supervised the construction of the railroad line up Saluda Grade and on into Hendersonville. He saw the need for housing both railroad workers and visitors. Mountain House was located on the hill that was bordered by Greenville, Irwin, and what is now Smith Hill. Unfortunately, it burned. Melrose Inn, located on Henderson Street, built in 1893 by Emma and Agnes Harriet from Charleston. It was a huge and attractive inn that burned during the Depression, unfortunately. Then we come to Crystal Springs, built in 1901 by Charles Estes of Augusta, Georgia. He installed a ram, a water supply system, near the springs. Water was pumped into a tower belonging to Melrose Inn, then piped to both the Melrose Inn and Crystal Springs. These were the first 2 establishments to have running water for their guests. The pond, ye old swimming hole, below the spring came after the city provided water. Crystal Springs is owned and operated by Martha Ashley, the granddaughter of Charles Estes. That's Crystal Springs. That's the pond. And here we are having a beach party. All right, this is the Baumberger House, located on Cullifer and Henderson Streets. You remember where the fire truck was? That's where this was.
Across from the bank.
Yeah, across from the bank. It was owned and operated by Maggie Baumberger from 1890s to 1918 when it burned. It was a huge house with summer guests and railroad workers. Her brother ran the livery stable and met all the trains in his fine carriage, Surrey with the fringe on top. And I talked with her grandson, and he said that, of course, he didn't remember it, but he heard stories of how it was inside, and the service provided was wonderful. Unfortunately, a lot of these burned. The next one is Boxwood Terrace. Originally, Aiken's Acre was the residence of Mrs. Still, and she operated as a boarding house in the mid-30s. It is presently the residence of David and Marguerite Hankins. This one is the Osceola Inn, built in 1901 above Osceola Circle. It was owned by Mrs. J.K. Campbell of Chester, South Carolina, until her death in 1937. Zelda Fitzgerald, authoress and wife of F. Scott Fitzgerald, was often a guest here. The inn accommodated band members of Mr. Land's summer program in the late 30s. Concerts were performed in the town park gazebo. This is the Pace House, originally a stagecoach inn. Pace House was owned and operated by Ransom Woodruff Pace. Later, the house was converted into apartments. The house was torn down in 1968 to make way for Autumn Care Nursing Home, located on Osceola and Substation.
It had been remodeled, though,
Yeah.
before they tore it down.
This is Ransom, and his wife is the lady in the middle. Yeah, it was one of the original places for the cattle and all. Yeah, it was a drover's paradise. Okay. This will show you what the dining room was like, and this is one of the servants in there. Next, we have the Whaley House, located on Sham Street. This house was built in 1897 by A.B. Whaley of Charleston. It was operated as a boarding house for many years and is presently owned and occupied by Roger Goss. It is really a lovely house inside. Then we have Ivy Terrace, located on 176. It was owned and operated by L.L. Clifford as a boarding house in the early 1930s until the late 1940s. Ivy Terrace is now owned by Herbert and Diane McGuire. St. Cloud House, built on Seminary Street in 1909 as Ryder Hall, a girls' dormitory for the Saluda Seminary. It was built by the American Missionary Association. It was 1920, became the Mountain Manor and was operated as a hotel, and is presently a private residence of Judy and Charles Brown. 18 bedrooms, 2 people. Wonderful. Next, we have the Charles Hotel, which was on Charles Street across from Transfiguration. Built in the early 1900s by Charles Estes of Augusta, Georgia. It was located on Henderson and Charles Street. Unfortunately, it burned in the 1920s. The firemen went up on the porch and brought all the rocking chairs down and put them in the street, and everybody watched it burn. This is Shanty Shan. It's a beautiful log boarding house owned by Mrs. Rogers. Her daughters were Mrs. Tallfrey of New Orleans, Louisiana, and Mrs. Brewster of Mobile, Alabama. Located on Louisiana, it is the present residence of Janelle Jesperson. It's still there, but they built around it and enveloped the house. So her house is still Shanty Shan, but with additions. Fairview House, built in 1901 on Charles Street and run by H.P. Locks and Mrs. Rosa Box. Mary and Ray Baisden purchased the property in the 1940s and ran the house as an inn until 1960s. Yeah, that's the big house. The big house was torn down several years ago, and the cottage now owned and occupied by Terry and Fred Baisden, our mayor. This house, Fred said that it just kind of deteriorated, and they let somebody come in and just tear it down. But the cottage right here in the front has been remodeled, and that's where Terry and Fred live. This is Wells' home, a boarding house on Henderson Street, later known as the Woods House. It became a B&B for several years, and it was run by Dottie Ervil, and it's presently the home of John and Elena Morgan. But you know where that is? It's got the red tin roof as you come up Church Street right here. My favorite, the Pines. The Pines is located on Henderson and Charles Street, and originally was owned by Mrs. Mattie E. Hopkins and she ran it as a boarding house. It was remodeled in the late 1940s by Francis and Jack Strope. It still has the room numbers on the doors and is now owned and occupied as a summer residence by Steve and Jackie Pace. Bon Air, built by the Haynes sisters in the 1890s on the present-day Smith Hill, was occupied as a boarding house until one of the sisters married Dr. Smith. Vivi Blackshear, their granddaughter, now occupies the home. That's the back side of the house. That's the front entrance that she uses now. It's been totally redone and is beautiful. She's done a fantastic job. Built as a private residence by Dr. Gillette, it became a guest house in 1914, operated by Mrs. L.A. Leland from McClellanville. The dwelling was sold in the mid-1940s to Irma Mason, became known as the Saluda Inn. It was also operated by Jim Reeves and is presently owned and operated by Richard and Joni Ruschenbach. The next we have the Oaks. Located on Greenville Street, it was owned and operated by Mrs. H.B. Lane of Charleston and later her daughter Louise Stubbs. It was built by Dr. Gillette for his eldest daughter. The house is now a B&B owned and operated by Dale and Donna Petruski. This is Seagulls House, located on Greenville Street. It was operated by the Seagulls and daughter Agnes Waters until the 1930s. It was remodeled and enlarged by E.K. DeLoach and was renamed Skyview Lodge. The house was torn down to make way for the Saluda Medical Center. Mrs. Bushnell's house kept boarders at what was better known as the Overbrook Orchard. This was a large two-story house with many bedrooms. The property was purchased by Mr. Corwith, and Mrs. Bushnell bought a house in town on Henderson Street known as the Hensley Hall, but Mrs. Bushnell never ran a boarding house. This was originally, there was a orchard before Ozone was built, all the way from Louisiana back, and the house, this house stood, as you go down Ozone towards I-26, the house was on the left on top of the hill. And I said it commanded a really beautiful view. And last but not least, from one mountain to another mountain, we come to Mountain Home, located on 176. It was built as a vacation retreat for the Brotherhood of Railway Clerks, recently known as the White Stag Inn, then the Railroad House, and more recently as Orchard Inn, a B&B formerly owned and operated by Bob and Kathy Thompson and is now run by Mark and Marianne Blazer. And with that, from mountain to mountain, concludes the presentation. Thank you all for coming.